What's up, YouTube? Today we're going to talk about how to get started before you're ready. So ultimately in the past, the biggest thing that's held me back was like waiting to have everything in line before I started something, whether it's, studying for a test. I thought I had to read through every single textbook page, or if I was, getting ready for like an online course, I thought I had to go through like every single module before I actually moved on and implemented what I was learning. And I think the last thing was, if I was like playing a video game, I felt like I had to beat every single area. It was like this weird perfectionism that was holding me back. And I think ultimately this is a horrible habit to get into because it can completely hinder a lot of your progress and make you take a really, really long time to complete things. So about 2 years ago, I finished college and I had absolutely no clue what I wanted to do. I studied industrial engineering and had a bunch of terrible internships and co-ops and was completely disillusioned by work, and ultimately ended up getting out of college, working for 3 months and quitting my job. After that, I was kind of like frozen. I had no clue where to go from there, and it was really disillusioned with my life back on the East Coast. So kind of out of nowhere, I packed up my car in the middle of June in 2017 and left. I pretty much sold everything I owned and packed up my car with minimal amount of things to live and did a cross-country road trip. Never been to the West Coast, and I knew I just had to do it. And I think that was one of the most stressful times of my life. It's super scary to just, leave everything behind and start fresh somewhere new, but it's also kind of freeing. And I think that was my first foray into starting something before I was ready. I, didn't have any job lined up, had absolutely no plan. All I had in my head was I know I wanted to see some of the national parks on the West Coast. So I took a 3-month-long road trip, and after, seeing the West Coast and really getting a feel for a lot of these really cool places that I'd never experienced back east, I landed in Las Vegas and slept on a friend's couch for a few months, trying to figure out what was next. Now on this trip, I ended up trying to apply to jobs on the road. Nothing really came about, so when I was on my friend's couch in Las Vegas, I had to learn, or I had to pretty much do a lot of research to figure out like what I want to do with my career. And ultimately, I was looking at sales jobs, maybe back in Boston, and because the East Coast was really familiar, I was like, you know what, maybe I should just go back to the East Coast. But in Las Vegas, it was definitely uncomfortable, never been there, wasn't really a big fan of the city, but I ended up digging into some code, and I was like, playing around with like building super simple websites. And it was kind of interesting and unique, and I knew that in college, I tried out a handful of like computer science courses, and none of them worked out. I did terribly, I got C's in them, and it was just really painful and miserable. So during this time in Las Vegas, I ended up forcing myself to just do step-by-step, learn the basics of code. And I sat down and did a lot of research and saw that these coding boot camps were possible, like really good options for people who, wanted to make complete career switches in as little time as possible. So that was something that I looked at, pursued, and tried to learn the basics of code to see if it was even possible. Fast forward now, and about 1.5 to 2 years later, I've been in the software industry for 1 year, have a software job in San Francisco, pretty much out of nowhere. And I think ultimately this came down to forcing myself to learn something when I was completely not ready. I ended up choosing to go to a coding boot camp in San Francisco, and they basically gave you a 6-week pre-course that you have to go through and learn like by trial by fire. And it was really, really challenging. I had no clue what I was doing most of the time. But once I got the absolute basics of JavaScript down, then I moved on to some more advanced stuff. And basically throughout this course, the pre-course, they start introducing this concept of you need to do things before you're ready and before you feel ready, because you're never going to feel ready. And I think ultimately throughout this whole journey, that was the biggest takeaway. That's been the one thing that has helped me and improved my life so much, is just starting something. And I think in life, if I look back in the past, you're never going to be fully ready. There's always more things to learn and more things to do. One example of this was during this course where, pairing with a lot of people working together and both of the partners pretty much have no clue what they're doing throughout these problems. The coding bootcamp introduces a bunch of problems every 2 days, and you pretty much have to finish them to move on to the next one. And if you don't, which some people do, you have to linger on that and go back and redo it and finish it up, and just forcing yourself to get through the anxiety of being completely lost is the only way to get through it. One of the best ways to learn is to jump in and just test over and over, trial and error, play around with it, do a lot of research, but pretty much you have to get your hands dirty with the code. And every time, even in work today, when I have to jump into new technology, if I'm going to linger around and do a bunch of research before I even start coding, I'm never going to get the job done. And the only way to do it is to really just jump in, play around, break things as quickly as possible. Another example of this was in the coding bootcamp. They told us do not apply to jobs at all during this. Focus completely on code. And the second half of this coding bootcamp, I kind of got to the point where we were slowing down. We were doing our own unguided project during the last 6 weeks, and I was getting really eager to do the job search, and I didn't have my portfolio online, I didn't have my resume complete, I didn't have a lot of things. I didn't have, the full knowledge. I hadn't studied algorithms, but I was like, you know what? I really want a job as soon as possible. And now, the coding bootcamp introduced us to these concepts of just do it, just go do it right now. And I was like, you know what? I'm gonna start applying to jobs as soon as possible. So I think in the end of the day, I applied to 150 jobs, but before the coding bootcamp ended, I had applied to, probably like 40 or 50. And by the time I got out of the bootcamp, I had already had phone screens and interviews compared to some of the other people who hadn't even started applying. So I was kind of a step ahead. And then 2 weeks after, I had an on-site at a company. Now looking back, some people in our coding bootcamp didn't have on-sites until about 4 weeks after, 6 weeks after, just because the interview process takes so long, especially in technology. So after this on-site, I instantly had a job 2 weeks after the coding bootcamp ended, and I started the job a month after. So even starting halfway through the coding bootcamp, I was able to get a job within a month after it. So looking back, this whole process took about 6 months from start to finish, from first time touching code to the end of getting a job. And even there, that first job was insanely challenging. I think the technology, there were so many things I didn't know. I was pretty much working in a code base completely confused, asking people questions over and over. And I really, really struggled with that job, and I got back into the habit of, doing a lot of research before jumping into the code and things like that, and that kind of hindered me at that first job. Now I'm on my second job in Silicon Valley. I moved to a startup from a bigger company, and this was a great learning experience working at the startup. Everything here is much faster paced. Everything that I've been working on is pretty much brand new technology. I had definitely worked with some of the tech earlier, but I've had to learn so many more frameworks and concepts, and it's been great because it's really forced me, when you're in a fast-paced environment, you just have to complete something. You have to, even if it's a really hacky solution, you just have to jump in and go do it. It used to be really stressful and really anxiety-inducing, but over time, I've been able to practice this concept over and over and over of just do it before, I'm completely ready, and then you learn in tandem while you're coding. So as you're building it, you're learning and improving these concepts and skills. Ultimately, if I had waited to get all of these things lined up in the row for that first job, I would have wasted so much time and not even be getting paid for it. And I think one of the best things about technology, and one of the things that people overlook, is that even if you have horrible imposter syndrome and know that you don't know a lot, you can still get paid for the little bit that you know, because ultimately this is an extremely in-demand skill, and if you can even build something basic, you can learn on the job and get way better and provide a lot more value in that regard. So I think the best thing is, if you're looking for any kind of job, or even a tech job, and you're nervous about applying. You just have to go in and apply, and you have to send out a bunch of applications, and you're going to fail. And I think another reason why people, hesitate or get really anxious is because they're really scared of failing. And ultimately, failing is part of the process. You're supposed to fail. The people who, take forever to get a job might be so scared of failing that they stop applying, or they apply to like one company a week. And that's just not the best way to go about it. You don't want to be waiting like 6 months to 1 year. I have a handful of friends who have spent about a year job searching, and it's really, really tough when you're living in San Francisco and you don't have a job. And one of the things is like, it's really easy inside of your head to get locked up in this, like, I don't know, and what happens if I fail, and everything else. Like, what if I haven't studied this enough? It doesn't matter. You just have to go in and do it. So I think the final takeaway is that this skill can be applied to almost anything, and it will benefit you in so many ways. For example, when I started to apply the skill in technology, I was able to go in and I started a side business while I was doing my main job, and I ended up doing something where I bought an Instagram page that had over 1 million followers, and I started selling ad space in it. I had no clue what I was doing, super freaked out, but I made an LLC and I set up this business, and within 6 months I was able to generate profit, which was amazing. And that was super scary, but I was like, you know what? I have already gone through this process of having no clue what's going on, and I can just take this and apply it elsewhere. So now I've been able to apply this to the side business. I'm now applying it to YouTube. Right now, I have no clue how the camera works, really. Don't really know how the editing software works, but I think just recording and building a habit of doing this over and over and over is the only way to go about it. You can learn as you're building things. So my ultimate goal is to, keep shooting videos, learn how the camera works over time, learn how to edit over time. You have to take the plunge before you're ready. That's the most effective way to move forward in anything that you're working on or, jumping into, especially if it's brand new territory. You just have to do it. First video done.